In the heart of sunny Scottsdale, Arizona, a sleek luxury car dealership gleamed under the scorching desert sun, standing tall as a symbol of wealth and sophistication. But on this particular day, something unusual was about to unfold behind its glossy walls. Daryl, the man who owned the entire operation, wasn't dressed in the sharp suit and polished shoes one might expect from the owner of such an establishment. Instead, he wore a simple gray hoodie, slightly worn jeans, and sneakers, an outfit that blended him with any ordinary customer. His plan? To slip under the radar, to witness how the dealership truly operated when it didn't know the new boss was in the room. He parked his modest SUV at the back, far from the luxury vehicles lined up in front, and entered through the glass doors, unassuming but sharp-eyed, ready to observe. What he didn't expect was the subtle shift in energy. The looks, the assumptions, the judgments, they all unfolded before him like a silent script. Susan, the middle-aged manager with her tailored blazer and clipboard, approached him with a polite but thinly veiled skepticism. Was he really a customer worthy of their time, or just another person who didn't fit the image of the typical buyer? What began as a quiet, almost dismissive exchange would soon explode into an unforgettable moment of revelation. Daryl, with a calm and collected demeanor, had one simple question: "Can I speak to the owner?" What would happen next would leave everyone in the showroom frozen, questioning their assumptions, and wondering how someone like Daryl could turn the tables so dramatically. As Daryl stepped through the polished glass doors, the cool air hit him, a welcome contrast to the blistering Arizona heat. The showroom was a cathedral of luxury, rows of pristine vehicles reflecting the bright overhead lights. The faint scent of leather and fresh wax filled the air. Yet, it wasn't the cars that captured his attention, it was the people. The employees, scattered in small groups around the showroom, looked up as the door opened, their gazes lingering on Daryl, scrutinizing his casual attire. The tension in the air shifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, but it was there, undeniable. Among them was Susan. She was poised, immaculate, wearing a sharp blazer that spoke of authority, her polished heels clicking sharply against the tile floor as she walked toward him. A clipboard clutched tightly in her hands, she was the picture of professionalism, or at least she tried to be. Her eyes flicked over Daryl's hoodie and sneakers, a subtle narrowing of her gaze. The polite smile she wore didn't quite reach her eyes, and Daryl caught the briefest flicker of something that might have been judgment. "Excuse me," Susan said, her voice cool and controlled. "Can I help you with something?" Daryl met her gaze and offered a relaxed smile, his demeanor calm, almost too calm for someone who knew the silent war brewing in the space around them. "Just here to look around," he replied, gesturing vaguely toward the rows of cars. His voice was smooth, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world. Her gaze didn't soften. In fact, it sharpened as she studied him, taking in his casual attire and his unremarkable appearance. "Are you shopping for a car?" Her tone carried an edge, a barely veiled disbelief, as if she had already decided that someone like him couldn't possibly be in the market for one of their high-end vehicles. Daryl didn't flinch, still maintaining that calm exterior. He nodded slowly. "Something like that," he said, keeping his voice light, almost playful, though there was a flicker of annoyance inside him that he quickly suppressed. He had expected some kind of judgment, but this felt different. This felt personal. That Susan's lips tightened slightly, and for a moment, there was a slight crack in her polished mask. "We cater to a very specific clientele here," she continued, her words heavy with implication. "Most of our inventory requires pre-qualification. Perhaps I could recommend a different dealership." She didn't wait for a response, as if she had already decided what kind of person Daryl was, what kind of person he would be. Daryl raised an eyebrow, feeling the subtle sting of her assumption. He took a step forward, his body language casual but unyielding. "You're assuming I'm not qualified," he remarked, his tone almost gentle, though there was an unmistakable edge to his words. Susan faltered, but only for a moment. Her carefully curated professionalism returned quickly, and she stiffened, adjusting her posture, as if to regain control of the situation. "I'm just trying to save you some time," she replied, forcing another tight smile. "These vehicles start at 6 figures. Maybe I can direct you to a more suitable option." Daryl's eyes flicked to the silver coupe gleaming under the showroom lights. It was sleek, aggressive, and beautiful. He reached out, brushing his fingers against the door handle, before turning back to Susan. "Nice car," he said simply, his voice almost disinterested. The words hung between them, but Susan's face betrayed a hint of confusion. She was clearly taken aback by his lack of response, the calmness in his tone that was almost too collected for a man in his position. "It is," she replied, her brows furrowing slightly. "But when you're ready to make a serious inquiry, we can set up an appointment." "All right," Daryl said, his voice easy, dismissing her words as though they had no weight. "Let's hear it then. What would you recommend for someone like me?" Susan blinked, surprised by his sudden directness. The polished veneer cracked slightly as she hesitated before speaking. "Maybe something a little more budget-friendly," she said with a forced smile, her eyes still scanning him as though trying to place him in a category that didn't fit. Daryl's lips twitched in amusement, though his eyes remained cold. "I'll let you know when I'm ready for something budget-friendly," he said softly, the weight of his words hanging in the air between them. He couldn't ignore the sting of her assumption anymore. He had seen it too many times before, the judgment that came with how he looked, the dismissiveness that seemed so easily justified by something as insignificant as a hoodie. Before Susan could respond, another employee called out, interrupting their exchange. "Hey, Susan, the delivery guy is here." Susan's attention wavered, but she quickly returned her gaze to Daryl. Her voice was sharper now, the irritation creeping in beneath the polite mask. "Please don't touch the vehicles," she said, her tone firm as she turned to walk away. Daryl watched her go, his expression unreadable. He glanced back at the silver coupe, his reflection staring back at him. This wasn't just about buying a car anymore. It was about something deeper, something more personal. He had been here less than 10 minutes, and already, he had witnessed the kind of judgment he had always feared would come with the territory. He wasn't just a customer here. He was a test, and as he stood there, the quiet hum of the showroom continuing around him, Daryl knew that this was just the beginning. Something had to change, and he would make sure it did. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as Daryl stood in the center of the showroom, his hands casually tucked in his pockets, his gaze flicking over the array of luxury vehicles that lined the floor. The employees, who had initially returned to their conversations, couldn't resist stealing glances in his direction. The quiet hum of their chatter had dimmed, replaced by an almost palpable sense of discomfort. It was clear now. They were all watching him, judging him. Even if they weren't speaking, the silent scrutiny was undeniable. Susan returned a moment later, her posture rigid, her clipboard held as if it were a shield she could hide behind. She approached Daryl, her steps quick and purposeful, but there was a tension in her every movement, a tightness in the way she carried herself. She wasn't the same confident manager who had greeted him earlier. Now there was something else in her eyes, an unmistakable flicker of uncertainty. "I've compiled a few options that might be more suitable for your situation," she said, her voice now lacking the polished edge it had once held. She handed him a printout, her fingers almost trembling as she did. The paper rustled in his hand as he took it, his eyes scanning the list. Used sedans, an older SUV, and a compact hybrid, cars that looked like they had seen better days, their prices far below what a luxury dealership should offer. Her words echoed in his mind. "Your situation." The phrase had cut through him more than he cared to admit, revealing a deeper, more insidious form of judgment than he had expected. He folded the paper slowly, his fingers brushing against the creases as he tucked it into his pocket. He didn't need to say anything to her. His silence spoke volumes. "Appreciate the effort," he said, his voice even, betraying none of the frustration boiling under the surface. He glanced around the showroom again, his eyes cold, as if he were taking a mental inventory of everything he had just witnessed. He had hoped to give the benefit of the doubt, but now he could feel the weight of the assumptions, heavy and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. Susan's smile returned. Though it was forced now, her eyes darting nervously to the side. "Maybe when you're ready to make a real inquiry, we can set up an appointment," she said. But the words didn't carry the same conviction they had before. There was a crack in her facade now, a glimpse of the person beneath the polished exterior. And Darryl wasn't sure if that made him more upset or disappointed. His gaze lingered on her, reading the discomfort in her body language, the way her shoulders seemed to pull inwards, as though she were bracing for something. He could feel the tension building in the air, an electric charge between them that neither could deny. It was a moment frozen in time, a brief but powerful exchange that neither would forget. Then, Darryl broke the silence. He didn't need to raise his voice or make a scene. He simply spoke, his words deliberate and cutting through the growing discomfort like a blade. "What makes you think I'm not your target customer?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying an undertone of authority that caused Susan to stiffen, her smile faltering. There it was again, the assumption. Susan hesitated, her lips parting as if she were searching for the right words. "I've been doing this for a long time," she said finally, her tone defensive. "I can tell when someone's out of their depth." "Out of their depth?" Darryl repeated, his voice low but firm, a quiet challenge in his words. Interesting. The moment seemed to hang in the air, thick with the weight of their unspoken thoughts. Susan's eyes flickered briefly, a crack in her composure, before she forced herself to push forward. She stepped closer to him, her voice now laced with a thin layer of impatience. "I'm just trying to be honest with you. It's better to be upfront than to waste your time." Darryl's lips twitched in faint amusement, but there was no humor in it. "Honest, huh?" he asked softly, his tone barely above a whisper. "I like honesty." He paused, letting the words hang between them. "How about this? Let me speak to the owner. Maybe they'll understand me better." The challenge in his words hit Susan like a ton of bricks. Her eyes widened, and for the first time since their exchange began, she looked truly caught off guard. "The owner?" she repeated, her voice rising just slightly, almost incredulous. Darryl nodded, unfazed. "That's right," he said, his expression calm. But there was something underlying his tone now, something that shifted the dynamic between them. "I'd like to have a word with them." Susan's face hardened, but Darryl could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "That's not possible today," she said quickly, almost too quickly. "The owner doesn't just drop by for casual visits. They're busy." She turned to walk away, but not before shooting him a pointed glance, as if to remind him of his place. Darryl stood there for a moment, letting her words settle in the air before pulling out his phone, his fingers scrolling through his contacts. The showroom seemed to fall silent, the employees watching, their curiosity mounting with each passing second. With a quiet resolve, Darryl lifted the phone to his ear. "Yeah, it's me," he said into the receiver, his voice steady. "I'm at the dealership. Everything's fine. Just a little misunderstanding. Could you let them know I'm here?" He ended the call with a casual swipe of his finger, slipping the phone back into his pocket. Susan froze. She turned toward him, her mouth agape, her expression one of pure confusion. What are you doing?" she stammered, her tone faltering. Darryl's eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, there was nothing but the weight of silence between them. "Just calling the owner," he said calmly, his voice almost too nonchalant. "Shouldn't take long." Susan blinked, her mouth opening and closing, unsure of what to say next. Her carefully constructed confidence seemed to unravel piece by piece. All around them, the employees had stopped what they were doing, their attention now fully focused on the unfolding scene. The tension was unbearable. Darryl let the quiet stretch, giving Susan a moment to stew in her confusion. The room was still, thick with anticipation. Darryl, however, remained as calm as ever, his gaze steady, his posture unwavering. And as the seconds ticked by, he knew something was coming, something big, and he was ready for it. The atmosphere in the showroom was suffocating. The faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to intensify as the seconds dragged on, each one heavier than the last. Susan stood frozen, her face an open book of confusion, her mouth opening and closing like she was searching for the right words, but none came. Her eyes flickered from Daryl to the phone he had just tucked back into his pocket, her mind racing to piece together what was happening. The other employees had stopped pretending, their whispered conversations stilled in the air as they watched the unfolding drama. Daryl didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, unwavering, his calm demeanor sending a clear message. This was not just a misunderstanding. This was something more, something bigger. For a brief moment, the showroom felt eerily silent, as if the entire world had paused to watch. Daryl could hear his own heartbeat, steady and measured, as he stood there, observing the subtle shift in Susan's expression. The realization was starting to settle in. She was beginning to grasp what was happening. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of the front door opening cut through the stillness, a soft chime signaling the arrival of someone new. Daryl's eyes flicked toward the entrance, his body tensing for just a fraction of a second. A man in a navy suit stepped into the showroom, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor with the authority of someone who belonged. He was tall, sharp, and professional, his expression serious but warm as he scanned the room. And then his eyes landed on Daryl. "Mr. Carter," the man called out, his voice ringing with recognition. A smile spread across his face as he walked toward Daryl, extending his hand in greeting. "It's so good to see you." The shock on Susan's face was palpable. Her eyes widened, her posture stiffening as she blinked several times, her mind still trying to process what was happening. She looked back at Daryl, then at the man approaching him, her expression one of utter disbelief. "Alex?" Daryl replied, his voice calm, a hint of warmth in his words as he accepted the handshake. His smile was small, but there was something in it. A quiet power, a knowing that he had just changed everything. The tension in the room snapped, but not in the way Susan had expected. The realization dawned on her, slow and relentless. She took a small step back, her face draining of color as her gaze shifted between Daryl and Alex. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Alex, clearly aware of what had just unfolded, turned to Susan. His tone shifted, no longer the friendly warmth he had extended to Daryl, but a sharp professionalism. "Susan, I see you've already met Mr. Carter." He glanced at Daryl, an apologetic look flickering in his eyes. "I trust this wasn't your ideal welcome?" Susan stood there, frozen. Her hands trembled slightly, her clipboard now clutched tightly to her chest as if it were a lifeline. The reality of the situation crashed over her in waves, and for a brief moment, she was paralyzed by the embarrassment that surged through her. "I didn't realize," she began, her voice barely a whisper, but the words trailed off as if she couldn't quite bring herself to finish. The weight of her mistake was too much to bear, and she felt as if the ground beneath her had vanished. Daryl's expression softened, but there was no hiding the quiet strength in his voice when he spoke. "You didn't realize?" he repeated, his tone calm but with a weight that carried far more meaning than the simple question. "That someone like me could own a place like this?" His words cut through the air, sharp and clear, and for a moment, Susan seemed utterly lost. Her eyes widened, the realization settling in with a painful clarity. The sting of her assumption was now undeniable, and there was no escaping it. Daryl held up a hand, signaling that he wasn't angry. "It's fine, Susan," he said softly, his voice gentler than it had been before. "I think you and I just got off on the wrong foot." He took a small step forward, his gaze unwavering. "But let me ask you something," he continued, his voice dropping just enough to make everyone lean in. "If I hadn't been the owner, if I were anyone else, would you have treated me differently?" Susan's mouth hung open, but no words escaped. Her eyes darted around the room, as if searching for something to say, some way to defend herself, but the truth was inescapable. She had judged him based on the way he looked, based on the assumption that he couldn't possibly belong in a place like this. Daryl's gaze lingered on her for a moment, and then he turned to Alex, his voice now carrying an air of authority. "Let's gather everyone in the conference room. I think it's time we had a little chat about how things are run around here." The employees, still stunned by what had just transpired, slowly began to shuffle toward the conference room, the weight of the moment hanging over them like a heavy fog. Susan remained rooted to the spot, unable to move, her face flushed with embarrassment. Daryl's eyes never wavered as he glanced around the room. He was no longer the casual observer he had been when he first walked in. He had claimed his space, his power, without raising his voice or making a scene. The entire showroom had witnessed the shift, and they were all left wondering what would come next as Daryl walked toward the conference room. He spared one last glance at Susan. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet strength, a conviction that had been forged over years of dealing with judgment and prejudice. He wasn't angry. He was simply letting the weight of his words sink in. This wasn't just about one mistake. It was about something deeper, something that had to change. And Daryl was ready to make that change happen. Susan stood there, her hands still clutching her clipboard, a hollow feeling settling in her chest. She had underestimated him, but now she saw the man standing before her for what he truly was, and the realization stung more than she cared to admit. The conference room was cold, its sleek glass walls and modern furnishings offering little comfort to the employees who had gathered in tight, nervous clusters around the large oval table. The hum of whispered voices, though hushed, carried through the air, but there was a tension to the room that made every word feel heavier than it was. Susan sat near the back, her back straight, her hands tightly gripping the edges of her chair as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. Her face, once confident and poised, was now flushed with a deep red hue, betraying the storm of emotions swirling inside her. She hadn't expected this. None of them had. The man she'd so easily dismissed, based solely on his appearance, was the very person who owned the dealership. The realization had come crashing down on her the moment she saw him speak to Alex. The truth had hit her hard, like a slap to the face. How could she have been so blind? Daryl had asked her to gather everyone in the conference room. He didn't raise his voice, didn't demand anything. He simply said it with calm authority, and the weight of those words had been enough that as the last few employees trickled in and took their seats, Daryl stood at the head of the table, his posture commanding but not intimidating. He hadn't raised his voice once during the entire exchange, but there was an air of quiet confidence about him that made the rest of the room sit in stunned silence. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint click of a pen, the shuffle of papers, as everyone waited for the inevitable. Finally, Daryl cleared his throat. "Thank you all for joining me on short notice," he began, his voice even but carrying an undeniable weight. "For those of you who don't know, my name is Daryl Carter, and as of last month, I'm the new owner of Prestige Motors." Murmurs rippled through the room, a mix of surprise, disbelief, and embarrassment. Some of the employees exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others simply stared at Daryl, trying to process what they had just learned. "I came here today dressed casually for a reason," Daryl continued, his tone measured but firm. "I wanted to see how this dealership operates when no one knows who I am. I wanted to experience what a potential customer might feel walking through these doors." His eyes briefly flicked over to Susan, and she could feel the weight of his gaze like a physical presence. It made her stomach tighten, a knot forming in the pit of her stomach as the events of the past few minutes replayed in her mind. She had judged him, based on his clothes, his demeanor, and she had done it without a second thought. Daryl paused, allowing his words to settle. The silence stretched on for a moment, thick and uncomfortable, before he continued. "What I experienced today was disappointing," he said quietly, but there was an edge to his voice now, one that Susan couldn't ignore. "I was judged not for what I could bring to the table, but for how I looked." Her heart sank as his words hit home. She could feel the weight of the room's collective gaze on her, all eyes slowly turning toward her. She had expected this moment to come, but nothing could have prepared her for how heavy the guilt felt. She wanted to speak, to explain herself, to defend her actions, but the words stuck in her throat, like stones lodged deep inside. She had no excuse. Daryl continued, his voice unwavering. "I'm not here to single anyone out. but we need to talk about what that says about the culture of this dealership. His eyes swept across the room, meeting the gaze of every employee. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who walks through those doors, every customer who doesn't fit into someone's preconceived notion of what a luxury car buyer looks like. The word stung. She had always prided herself on being a good manager, on maintaining professionalism, but the truth was undeniable. She had let her biases cloud her judgment. And now, Daryl was asking her to face it head-on. One of the younger sales associates hesitantly raised his hand. Mr. Carter, I think most of us try to treat customers fairly, but sometimes it's hard not to make assumptions. Daryl nodded, his expression thoughtful. I get that, he said. We all have biases, whether we want to admit it or not. But here's the thing, it's not enough to just try to be fair. We have to actively challenge those biases. Susan's breath caught in her throat. She felt the weight of his words, and for the first time, she truly understood the depth of her mistake. This wasn't just about her being wrong about a customer. It was about the culture she had allowed to thrive under her watch, one where assumptions were made, where people were judged based on their appearance. It was about creating a space where respect and inclusivity were more than just words on a mission statement. Daryl's gaze shifted back to her. Susan, he said softly, but there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. I want to give you the opportunity to speak. Is there anything you'd like to say? The room fell silent again, and Susan's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the heat of everyone's gaze on her, and for a moment, she wanted to shrink away, to escape the weight of this moment. But she knew she couldn't. She opened her mouth, and the words came out in a rush. I made a mistake, she admitted, her voice shaky but sincere. Her eyes were downcast, her hands trembling in her lap. I misjudged you, and for that, I'm truly sorry. There was a long pause, a brief eternity where she could feel the weight of everyone's expectations. But then, Daryl nodded, his expression unreadable. Thank you for saying that, he replied, his voice calm, though the words carried more weight than anything he had said before. I hope this experience will serve as a reminder for all of us. Not just you, but for everyone in this room. Because change starts with accountability. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Susan nodded, her throat tight. She felt like a failure, but in that moment, she also felt something else. A deep, raw determination to do better, to be better, because she had learned a painful but invaluable lesson. One that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Daryl's voice broke the silence once again. And when he spoke, it was clear that this was just the beginning. Moving forward, we'll be implementing new training programs, he said. I want to ensure that this dealership represents the values I believe in. Every customer deserves to be treated with dignity, no exceptions. And as Daryl stood there, ready to guide them into this new era, Susan realized that the work was only just beginning, for all of them. But she was determined to be part of the change, no matter how difficult it might be. The room fell into an uneasy stillness after Daryl's declaration. The weight of his words hung in the air, pressing down on the shoulders of every employee in the room. Susan sat there, her heart racing, her hands still trembling in her lap. She had known, deep down, that this day was coming, but now that it was here, the reality of it felt far more daunting than she had ever imagined. Daryl wasn't just holding her accountable, he was holding everyone accountable. This was no longer just about one misstep. This was about a shift in culture, one that would require every person in this room to confront their biases, to reassess everything they thought they knew about their work and about themselves. Daryl stood at the head of the table, his posture calm but resolute, as if he had already anticipated the weight of the moment. Starting next week, he continued, his voice steady but carrying a clear undercurrent of determination. We'll be implementing new training programs. These programs aren't just about customer service. They're about respect, about inclusivity, about understanding that no matter who walks through that door, whether they're dressed in a suit or a hoodie, they deserve to be treated with dignity. The tension in the room thickened as the employees exchanged glances, some uneasy, others silently defiant. The reality of what Daryl was asking seemed almost impossible. Could they really change the way they saw their customers? Could they erase the assumptions that had been built over years of working in an industry that had always prized appearance and status over substance? Could they reshape the very culture of the dealership? One conversation, one sale at a time. Daryl's gaze swept across the room, his eyes locking with each employee for a fraction of a second, as if he were trying to gauge their reaction, their willingness to embrace the change he was demanding. "This is not optional," he said, his tone carrying the full weight of his authority. "If you're not on board with this, if you can't see the value in creating an environment where every customer feels valued and respected, then maybe this isn't the right place for you." The words landed with a heavy thud. For a brief moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening. The employees who had been whispering earlier now sat frozen, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. What Daryl was proposing wasn't just a shift in policies, it was a fundamental shift in their very mindset. It was a challenge to their entire approach to their work, to the way they viewed their customers, and to the way they viewed themselves. Susan's mind was racing, her stomach tightening with each passing second. She had been the one to dismiss Daryl, to judge him based on his appearance. But now, she realized how deeply ingrained those biases were in herself, and in everyone around her. How many times had she made assumptions about customers based on their clothes? How many opportunities had she missed to truly connect with someone simply because they didn't fit the mold she had created in her mind? She felt a wave of guilt wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by something else: determination. She couldn't undo the mistakes she had made, but she could be part of the solution. She could lead the way in making the dealership a place where everyone, no matter their background, their appearance, or their wealth, felt welcome. "I know this isn't going to be easy," Daryl continued, his voice softer now, but no less firm. "It's going to be uncomfortable at times. There will be moments where you'll have to confront things about yourself that you don't like. But that's the only way we can grow. And that's the only way we can build the kind of dealership that people will trust, not just because of the cars we sell, but because of the way we treat people." The room seemed to exhale collectively. There was a sense of resignation in the air, but also a flicker of hope. For some, this change felt like a threat, a reminder that their comfort zone was being stripped away. For others, it was a call to action, an opportunity to grow, to rebuild, and to become something better. Susan felt her pulse quicken as Daryl's words began to sink in. She thought back to her conversation with Daryl earlier, the subtle judgment in her voice as she had assumed he couldn't afford the cars they sold. She had never realized how deeply those assumptions ran, how they had shaped the way she interacted with everyone around her. But now there was no escaping the truth. She had to change. They all did. And to help facilitate this change, Daryl added, his gaze landing on Susan, "I'll be scheduling one-on-one meetings with each of you. We'll talk about the steps you'll need to take to align with this new vision. I don't expect you to be perfect, but I do expect you to try." Susan nodded, her throat tight as she silently promised herself that she would. She would do better. She would make things right, not just for Daryl, but for everyone who walked through the doors of this dealership. She couldn't afford to let this moment pass without fully embracing it. "You'll all receive a detailed schedule for the upcoming training sessions," Daryl continued, breaking her thoughts. "We'll cover everything from bias awareness to effective communication to how we can make sure every customer feels heard, respected, and valued. I expect you to engage fully. No half measures." There was a sense of finality in his words, a clear signal that Daryl's resolve had hardened. This wasn't just about making the dealership better. It was about reshaping everything they thought they knew about customer service, about professionalism, about how people should be treated. It was about tearing down the walls that had been built over the years, brick by brick, and rebuilding them with a foundation rooted in empathy, respect, and understanding. As the meeting came to a close, Susan couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this shift in perspective, had just begun. She didn't know what the future would hold, but one thing was clear. Daryl wasn't just going to let this slide. He was determined to make sure that change happened, and she was going to have to be right there with him, every step of the way. The sound of chairs scraping against the floor filled the room as employees began to stand, the tension still lingering in the air. But this time it was different. It wasn't just the weight of fear and uncertainty. It was the weight of a shared responsibility. The weight of change. As the meeting ended and the employees began to leave the conference room, a sense of quiet reflection lingered in the air. The tension that had filled the room only moments ago seemed to dissipate, replaced by an unspoken understanding. This wasn't the end of the journey. It was merely the beginning of something much bigger. Daryl had set the tone, but the work had only just begun. For Susan, it felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders, but there was also a newfound sense of responsibility. She had made a mistake, yes, but now, in this moment of self-awareness, she saw how critical it was to embrace change. She couldn't undo the past, but she could shape the future. She could be the catalyst for transformation, not just within the dealership, but within herself as well. This lesson wasn't just about business. It was about humanity, respect, and personal growth. Change, as Daryl had so wisely pointed out, was uncomfortable. It required confronting biases, assumptions, and habits that had been ingrained for years. But the beauty of change is that it is possible, even when it feels difficult. And with the right mindset, it becomes a powerful force for good. The most important lesson here was simple. Growth starts with accountability, and it starts with individuals who are willing to take responsibility for their actions. Susan took a deep breath as she walked out of the conference room. She wasn't walking away from her mistakes. She was walking toward a new version of herself, one who would be more mindful, more inclusive, and more open-minded in her approach. The training sessions Daryl had promised would be tough, but she knew they would be worth it. She was determined to lead by example, to make sure that every customer who walked through those doors was treated with respect and dignity, no matter what they wore or how they looked. And for the rest of the employees, the shift was clear. This was no longer just about selling cars. It was about building relationships, earning trust, and creating a space where everyone, employees and customers alike, felt valued. Daryl's leadership had set a new standard, and everyone in the room understood that they needed to rise to meet it. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be worth every step. As Daryl observed his team, he felt a surge of optimism. He had set the foundation, and now it was up to each individual to take ownership of the change. There was no going back. They were moving forward together with a shared goal, to build not just a successful dealership, but a company that people respected, trusted, and felt comfortable in. In the end, the true lesson here is that leadership is not just about making decisions. It's about setting an example. It's about guiding others to become the best version of themselves, even when it requires difficult conversations and uncomfortable truths. It's about acknowledging that change is hard, but it's also the most powerful tool for improvement. As the employees filed out of the room, Daryl knew that they were ready. The first steps had been taken. The real work would begin tomorrow, with each of them making the choice to do better, to be better. If you've been inspired by this story, if you've learned something about the power of personal growth, accountability, and embracing change, make sure to hit that subscribe button. This journey towards self-improvement, transformation, and success is something we can all take part in. Together, we can create a better future for ourselves and for those around us. Let's keep moving forward, let's keep growing, and let's keep learning. Thank you for watching, and remember, growth begins with you. Don't just watch from the sidelines. Take the first step and make a difference today. Subscribe and join us as we continue to explore more inspiring stories that challenge us to be better, do better, and live better. You don't want to miss the next chapter in this transformative journey. Stay tuned.